Jack had lived alone for so many years that the creak of the old floorboards and the whisper of wind through the eaves had become his only constant companions. He kept the farmhouse the way a man keeps an oath, steady and simple, one room tidied before the next, kettles set to boil before the sun cleared the loblolly pines that bordered the back pasture. Lowfield, Georgia lay a few miles down the road, a feed store, a church, 2 diners that shared the same 6 stools, but Jack Mercer didn't need much of it. He had a patchwork garden, a root cellar he'd dug with his own hands, and a leaning shed with walls steeped in oil and cedar. Some winters he planted rye to hold the soil. Some summers he let the earth rest and only coaxed tomatoes and okra from a square of loam near the porch. He spoke when spoken to, nodded at passing trucks, and measured the seasons by the color of the sky at dusk. If he thought of the past, he did it in small doses, the way a man takes medicine, enough to keep the ache honest, not enough to lay him low. When he thought of Caleb, he did it with the gentle steadiness of a man remembering the surest hand he'd ever held. The house took the quiet in and kept it, and Jack moved through it as if silence were a kind of prayer. Behind the shed, along the old fence line where broom sedge flamed brown in fall, a strange mound had risen in the ground not long after Jack moved in. He had noticed it first as a slight swell, the kind you'd blame on a gopher or a half-rotted root pushing up as it softened. Years taught him the language of dirt, and this had not spoken plainly. Each season it was different by a hair, an inch higher one year, a shade wider the next. Grass took to the yard in generous patches, but the top of that mound stayed thin and forgetful, the blades there bleached and brittle even in wet months. Sometimes, after long, hard heat, a hairline crack worked along its crest, as if the earth were a lip pressed tight over a secret. Jack would nudge it with the toe of his boot and listen. Once he thought he heard a faint metallic answer drift back through the soil, a sound so small you could talk yourself out of it if you wanted. He did, for a long time. He was a man who dug enough holes to know most of what the ground hides isn't worth a blister. And yet the mound had a way of staying in his periphery. Jack would lift the shed door, hinges complaining like old knees, and stand with his shadow spilling across the yard, eyes wandering to that stubborn rise. The shed smelled of grease and pine dust, the floor scarred by years of projects. A mower blade sharpened to a mean edge, a hoe handle sanded smooth and fitted snug to new steel, a jar of loose screws that he'd always meant to sort. The world had narrowed to manageable corners. The porch that faced the fields, the shed that kept storm stories in its rafters, the kitchen where the kettle clicked just before boiling. The mound stayed a question he didn't owe an answer to, until one autumn when the light took on that thin, hard clarity the south gets before the first frost, and he realized he could see the mound from the porch without trying. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a shape with edges, a thing that cast its own small shadow, even at noon. Harlan Pruitt wandered up the drive one afternoon with a gait like a man who's been trusted by dogs and tractors longer than people. He propped a chicken wire gate under his arm, a favor to swap for a jar of pickled beans. "You still got that hump by the fence, Jack?" he asked, peering around Jack's shoulder at the yard. "Looks like it's taller than a milk crate now." Jack shrugged. "Probably a root that doesn't know it's dead." Harlan snorted. "Or a bootlegger's safe from back when my daddy had more sense than the law. Or an armadillo with an engineering degree." Jack didn't rise to it. Harlan took the hint, set down the gate, and changed the subject to weather. When he left, he tipped his hat and looked once more at the mound like he was measuring it for a suit. The first frost came early. The pasture turned a pale blonde that held the wind in its teeth. Jack stepped out one morning and saw that while silver had laid itself across every blade of grass in the yard, the crown of the mound was bare, dark, and faintly damp, as if the night's cold had balked there and gone around. He squatted, pressed his palm to the earth, and felt not heat but density, something that returned the pressure of his hand with its own. The memory of that faint metallic echo came back with a stubbornness he didn't like. He pulled his glove off and tapped his knuckles lightly against the top. The sound that travelled back into his bones wasn't the hollow thud of loose dirt. It was a soft, reluctant answer, like iron speaking through a blanket. That week, it rained hard. Red clay bled down the lane and pooled in tire ruts. Jack watched from the kitchen window as water stood in shallow mirrors around the yard. The mound shed it. Puddles gathered at its base, but never lingered on its back. He had spent his life reading the ground for what it meant. Moisture hiding 3 inches down, roots webbed where you'd least want them. And none of this added up to natural. Nights ran longer after that, the house offering less comfort than habit. He found his eyes drawn to the back window in the dark, as if the yard might speak if he was patient enough. Nothing did. The only voices were crickets and the occasional rush of a truck on the road far beyond the hedgerow. On a morning that felt like a thin sheet of tin between sky and land, Jack decided. He made coffee strong enough to put hair on iron, set the mug on the porch rail until steam thinned to a ghost, and went to the closet near the back door. The shovel waited there like an old friend you'd avoided and missed at the same time. The handle bore the gloss of 1,000 grips. He threaded his arms into a canvas coat, stretched the stiffness from his shoulders, and walked to the mound with something that felt too much like dread to call it curiosity. The first bite of earth came easy, as if the topsoil had consented long ago to being disturbed. Jack worked in a rough circle, moving dirt a spade at a time, cutting the plug clear of the mass beneath. The sound came sooner than he expected. A dull, thick note rolled up the shaft of the shovel into his palms. He froze, breath fogging against the raw light, and knelt. Fingertips, even through gloves, learn what eyes can't. He brushed away clay that clung like memory until the corner of something regular emerged. Rust had chewed it to scab, but geometry survives where flesh doesn't. A seam, a line, the suggestion of a hinge. He widened the hole, careful as if the dirt were a lung he didn't want to collapse. More metal revealed itself, pitted and stubborn. The mound, he saw it now, had been the earth making room for what it couldn't digest. Jack went to the shed and came back with a pry bar and a hammer whose wooden handle had drunk sweat for 30 years. He worked the lip of the bar under what passed for a lid and leaned with his weight slow and steady, the way you lever a rock that will break your foot if you let it jump. Rust protested. Something gave with a crack that startled the cold air. He paused, chest rising slow, listening to a world that had seemed simpler 5 minutes earlier. He pried until a triangle of darkness yawned. The scent that rose wasn't rot, it was oldness distilled. Oil, mildew, the sweet flat breath of paper sealed from air, a ghost of gun solvent. Jack crouched and waited until his eyes adjusted, then reached in. His hands found cloth first, coarse and stiff, folded with the kind of care that turns habit into ritual. He pulled it out and shook the dirt loose. A uniform jacket, faded to the color of forget-me-nots left in the sun. Sleeves creased where they'd been asked to remember a shape. On the shoulder, a patch so dulled by time, you had to lean close to read the ghost of its thread. He laid the jacket on the grass like he was setting down a body and reached again. Boxes of ammunition, their labels crisp even under grime, brass dulled to a thoughtful brown. A leather belt coiled like a sleeping snake. A tin the size of a deck of cards that clicked when he worried the lid. A folding knife. A cigarette case with initials cut in by a patient hand. A photo too stuck to see without tearing. He left it be. His fingers closed around weight that felt like decision. He drew out a pistol with finish worn to blue-grey, the metal taking his cold like a handshake. He checked the action without meaning to, the motion coming from the part of the brain that remembers its own. He set the gun down as if it could overhear. At the bottom of the chest, near the back corner, his knuckles brushed canvas. He pulled free a sack that crackled like old bread. The knot that shut it had petrified. He worked it loose with the tip of the knife and poured into his palm the first bundle of bills. The paper felt thin as onion skin. The ink had the sober, serious shade money wore in another century. He held one up to the light. A bank name he'd only seen in black and white photographs stared back, honest and extinct. The sack contained more bundles, some wrapped in brittle bank bands, some tied with string gone flaky with age. He looked into the box once more, careful now, and found a chain that clinked like a small wind through old pipes. Dog tags. Tarnish had softened their glare, but the letters were still muscle deep in the metal. Thomas K. Kincaid. A number, a blood type. a denomination stamped in the language of a particular war. Jack said the name aloud, and it put a weight in the air that hadn't been there a second ago. Beneath the tags lay a sheaf of letters tied with twine. The envelopes were addressed in a steady masculine hand that had known how to shape attention into script. Mr. Thomas K. Kincaid. Some bore Lowfield postmarks from just after the war. Others were stamped in cities that meant trains and distances. The return address on many read Andrew Kincaid, brother. Jack turned one over in his hands and felt the paper crackle under his thumb. The twine turned to dust when he tried to loosen it, so he slid the top letter free carefully, eased it open, and read a few lines. My dear Tom, I've kept the shed in order like you asked, and the men from the yard still look my way when I walk by, but they've come twice now, and they don't mind asking questions like they own every answer. Keep the box where you said, and keep your head where I can't. If I'm wrong, you'll write and laugh at me for an old woman in a man's clothes. If I'm right, I'll be glad of your caution. Your brother, Andrew. Jack folded the letter the way he'd found it and slid it back with fingers that didn't trust themselves. He set the pile next to the jacket, sat back on his heels, and listened to the yard. The day hadn't changed, but it had, and he felt that new weight press against his ribs the way a storm presses against a window. Not violent yet, but intimate. He packed the chest's contents to the workbench, in order and with care, each piece laid as if he were making room for a man to stand where none could. He left the chest itself in the hole, empty now, and somehow smaller for it. He locked the shed and stood with the key cooling in his palm, then went inside and washed his hands slowly, as if the dirt would tell him more if he gave it time. Sleep did what it could, but left most of him awake. He saw the dog tags when he closed his eyes, and the line in that letter where a brother's worry rounded into warning. He had not asked for any of this, but here it was, on his bench, under his roof, in his head. Jack knew where to start. Lowfield's library was a low brick building with a roof that held heat and a kindness for men who didn't want to talk. He put on his coat, drove his old Ford into town, and nodded at the folks who waved because they always had. Mr. Porter sat behind the desk, a man whose hair had gone silver, one orderly row at a time. He set aside his ledger when Jack placed the dog tags gently on the counter and said, I'd be obliged if I could see whatever you've got on a man named Thomas K. Kincaid. Mr. Porter read the name with his mouth, not his eyes, the way men do when they respect paper. He took Jack to a back corner where bound newspapers slept in boards thick as hymnals. The microfilm reader hummed itself awake, and Jack leaned into headlines that told a county's version of the world. Summer festivals, floods, barn fires, wedding announcements that called men strapping and stout-hearted. He found Kincaid on a page from 1946, a photograph of a young man in uniform, hat at an angle that said both Order and Pride, captioned SGT. Thomas K. Kincaid returns from Europe. There was mention of a Purple Heart, of a machine shop job waiting, of a small house west of town near the creek. No wife noted. A brother Andrew listed as next of kin. Jack flipped forward through time until the pages turned thin as breath. In 1952, there was a notice so small you had to trap it with your finger. Local man missing. Mr. Thomas K. Kincaid, 36, last seen at his residence. Authorities seeking information, no follow-up Jack could find. Men go off sometimes and never come back. And papers learn not to hold their place at the table. Property ledgers told a cleaner story. Mr. Porter showed Jack the lines in neat hand, where land passed from Kincaid to a couple from Valdosta in 1954. Maybe Thomas signed before he vanished. Maybe someone else signed when the law decided paper was more patient than people. Jack copied the address and thanked Mr. Porter with the quiet a man uses when he'd rather not be thanked back. On his way home, he drove past where the Kincaid house would have been. The creek cut a thin silver line through the field. A line of pecan trees stood patient and indifferent, the way trees get when they've survived enough owners to stop learning names. By the time Jack turned up his lane, the sky had gone the flat brass of late afternoon. He pulled into the yard and saw what the rain had written in the mud by the fence. New tire tracks. Too close to the edge to be an accident. He crouched and read the story in the tread. Stopped, idled, turned around slow. He looked up, felt the length of his property in the skin of his neck. The shed stood still under its lean-to roof, but the lock looked too bright in the shade, like an eye trying not to blink. Jack walked to the door and ran his thumb across the metal. Dust gave way to a smear that wasn't his. Inside, the workbench held what he'd placed there. Only the letters were wrong in a way you'd miss if the words weren't already living in your head. The stack had shifted by a crease. He stood for a long time and let his chest instruct his breath. Outside, a crow explained something to the trees and got no argument back. Jack closed the shed and slid the bolt firm. He went to the house, pulled the trunk from behind the couch, and lined it with an old army blanket. He wrapped the pistol in oiled cloth and set it deep, laid the jacket atop the blanket so the seams faced up like a road map. He tucked the dog tags under the fold, as if metal could feel a gesture's warmth. He slid the letters in between the jacket's layers, so the paper couldn't get the idea to speak out of turn. He poured the money out of its canvas and into a manila envelope he'd used for tax receipts back when receipts mattered more. He rested his hand on everything a moment, like a prayer for the unnamed, then closed the lid and turned the key. It made a sound you could put faith in. That evening, a truck slowed on the road beyond the hedgerow. Jack turned out his kitchen light and stood behind the curtain, a figure in his own house. The truck idled, crept past, and faded. Later, in the blue-grey before sleep takes whatever part of a man it can, Jack thought he saw a shape by the fence line, a man watching him. When he stepped out onto the porch with his flashlight off, the figure dissolved into the dark like salt in water. He sat there for an hour, the boards cold through his pants, until his breath stopped making clouds. The next afternoon, the man came up the drive in daylight. He wore a cap with no logo and a softness at the mouth that tried to pass for neighbourly. "Sir," he said, as if the word could buy him anything it wanted. "Name's Collins, doing some little bit of history work for the county. Heard tell your property used to belong to a Kincaid." Jack's silence didn't require effort. Collins smiled like that had been the answer he'd hoped for. "You never find anything back there?" Old farmers bury all manner of things they forget before they die. He shaded his eyes and looked toward the shed with an interest he didn't mind showing. "If you do find anything, it's best it ends up in the right hands." Jack said, "That's so," and kept his hands in his pockets, so the urge to show Collins the door wouldn't travel to his fingers. Collins nodded, as if they'd agreed on a price neither had spoken. "We'll be around," he said, and left with the kind of slowness men use when they want a back to itch. That night the wind came down from the north and rattled the loose tin on the shed like a warning in a language Jack understood too well. He sat with the trunk at his feet, his hand on the lid, and thought of Andrew Kincaid writing carefully, and Thomas Kincaid reading fast. He thought of Caleb, of the way the world leaves you this side of loss and expects you to turn the soil anyway. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Mason," he said when the line clicked and a voice from another county answered, rough with sleep or bourbon. "I need a favor that starts with a truck and ends with less trouble than I've got now." Mason Turner had been sheriff 2 counties over for 25 years and retired only when his knees told him warnings were better delivered from a chair. "You sound like a man who finally dug where he shouldn't," Mason said, with fondness that knew better than to add pity. They met in the morning. Mason's truck was the colour of gravel and had a dent in the fender where a fence post had taught it humility. He stepped out with the ease of a man who could still take a punch and make a pot of coffee without measuring. Jack told the story as far as it belonged to him. The mound, the chest, the dog tags, the letters, the bills, the man who smiled without a logo. Mason listened with his eyes on the yard, as if the ground might nod at the right parts. "You did right to call," he said. "Anything with letters and money and a man who went missing is an invitation to men who don't mind reading other people's mail." They carried the trunk to the truck bed, covered it with a tarp, and strapped it down like it might try to leave on its own. Mason set his hand on the lid the way Jack had, and the 2 men stood there long enough for the cold to stain their ears. "I'll put this where it won't be found by anyone with an easy conscience," Mason said. Then we'll decide whether it belongs to the state, a museum, or whatever's left of the Kincaids. Might take legwork, might take luck. Jack nodded. He didn't ask for receipts or promises. He trusted Mason the way a man trusts the first light in the morning, not because it's owed, but because it comes. The days after the trunk left were strange for their lack of strangeness. The tire ruts at the fence line dried and filled. No shadows lodged themselves where the hedgerow thinned. No trucks idled long enough for Jack's eyes to get used to their shape. The shed resumed its old music. Oil drip, wasp buzz, the careful click of a man sorting screws into jars he'd been meaning to label since 1991. He cleaned the workbench because there was nothing else left to clean. He put the pry bar back on its hook, wiped the rust off the hammer face, and stacked 3 cut lengths of pine where the wall leaned. The hole where the chest had been yawned like missing teeth until he filled it with earth, he tamped down slow. He scattered a paper packet of wildflower seeds over the scar because a man ought to leave beauty where secrets once were. The winter sun took its time backing off. The soil settled. The ground remembered it had other work to do. Mason called from time to time with the voice of a man who understood that telling a story was more important than finishing it. He'd found a paper trail that trailed off, a brother who'd died in a factory accident in '58, a second cousin once removed who'd moved north and stayed there, a storage room at the courthouse where half a file on Tonquet. Kincaid had gone to mice, and the other half had been misplaced by people who spelled misplaced in 5 different ways. He said the money was real and old and more complicated than folks with badges like to see. He said the pistol would find a box with a tag in a museum somewhere decent if that was all right with Jack. He said the letters belonged to men who had earned their voices, and there'd be a way to keep them read without leaving them to burn. Jack said yes, because there are times you give the past to someone whose hands are big enough. Spring came the way it always does in South Georgia, by degrees, and then all at once. The wildflowers Jack had scattered coaxed colour up through the thinning dirt. Indian blanket, coreopsis, a few volunteer coneflowers that must have blown in from the next county. The bees approved. Jack sat on the porch with his boots on the rail and let their fuss stitch the yard back together. He stopped jolting at the sound of a truck down on the road. He slept like a man who'd earned it. When he walked the fence line, he paused at the place where the mound had been and touched a thumb to the soft green there, as if to take a pulse. He thought of Thomas K. Kincaid and Andrew, who had written in a tone men reserve for love when they're not allowed to use the word. He thought of the pistol and the jacket and the way rust is just time making itself visible. He thought of Caleb and the long quiet 2 men can share without losing a word to it. One evening, just before the sky decided between gold and indigo, a sedan rolled slow past the lane and stopped where the mailbox leans like an old man telling a joke. A man stepped out, tall, with hair that had gone white in a way that made you trust it. He carried nothing and made sure Jack could see his empty hands. Jack went to the porch rail and waited. "Mr. Mercer," the man said, stopping before the gate. "Name's Charles Kincaid. My father was Andrew. I'm told you found something of my uncle's." Jack nodded. The world joined in his chest in a way that felt like 2 pieces of wood meeting flush. "We found pieces," he said. "A friend is keeping them where men don't stumble." Charles looked at the yard like he was reading a letter written in flowers. "I grew up on stories of a man who came back whole and then wasn't," he said. "Daddy didn't much like to guess, but I learned how to read what a man doesn't say." He took off his hat. "I'm not here to ask for anything not mine. I just wanted to see where he once was." Jack opened the gate with a hand that had known hinges since boyhood. They walked to the planting together. Jack said the names and the dates as he knew them. Charles said the versions he'd been given. Between them, a man began to grow out of paper and silence into something you could stand beside. They went to the porch and drank coffee that didn't need sugar because the evening did that work. When Charles left, he shook Jack's hand like you'd shake a handle you'd built yourself, glad for the fit. "Whatever becomes of the letters," he said, "I hope somebody reads them slow." Jack said he'd make sure of it, and when the sedan eased away, The quiet that returned was the kind you keep, not the kind you fear. Now and then, when the wind angled right, Jack still heard the shed talk to itself, a rattle of tin, a sigh of boards settling into their age. He kept the shovel by the door because there are always other holes to dig, some for posts, some for potatoes, some for the small graves men make for parts of themselves. He didn't think of the mound as a chapter closed so much as a door someone had finally bothered to open without kicking it off its hinges. On Sundays, he'd drive into town, sit near the back of the church because it was quieter there, and let the hymns do the heavy lifting. After, he'd stop by the diner, nod to Harlan Pruitt, and accept a plate like Grace. They spoke about weather and fences and the price of seed, and neither of them mentioned men who smile without logos. When summer broke its egg and poured heat across Lowfield, the wildflowers held their ground. Jack set a small, smooth stone in their midst, not a marker so much as a courtesy, a way to say someone had been expected here and met. He wrote no name on it. He didn't have to. He knew it, and the house knew it, and the bees didn't care as long as the asters came on time. If he sometimes paused at the back steps and felt the past lay its hand briefly on his shoulder, he didn't shrug it off. He understood a thing or two about burdens that become blessings once you lift them. When Mason called at last to say a museum would take the pistol and the jacket and display them with a small card that didn't pretend to know more than it did, that the money would go where history and law agreed it belonged, and that the letters, with the family's consent, would be preserved and read when read they ought to be, Jack thanked him and hung up and went to the door. The evening had gathered itself low and patient. Jack stood at the edge of the porch and listened to his land as a man listens to a friend who doesn't talk much. A whip-poor will said its name until the syllables became the shape of the light. The old fence line held. The shed leaned and would keep leaning, but not fall, not yet. Jack rested his palm on the porch post where Caleb's handprint once lived, worn to color by years of small affection. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Wind moved through the pines and carried nothing away that wasn't ready to go. The sky above him was bruised with the last violet of daylight, thin and streaked like smoke stretching across the horizon. The first stars were timid, as if reluctant to be seen too soon, but Jack knew their patience. They always arrived when the night had truly settled, when the frogs had begun their pulsing chorus from the ditch beyond the back pasture, when the crickets wound their clocks into steady rhythm. He leaned on the porch post and let the sound soak through him, a man-shaped silence filled with the company of small voices. He thought of Caleb again, not with sharp grief, but with that softened ache that comes when time has worn the edges smooth. The boy's handprint had been set there one summer afternoon after painting, when he'd slapped the fresh white post with a grin that left more mark than the paint ever could. Jack could almost feel the ghost of that smaller hand beneath his own calloused palm, a memory pressed into the wood, into him. The years had carried Caleb farther than these acres, but in the quiet of evenings like this, Jack felt him close, as if distance had never been invented. In the middle of the yard, where a mound had once pushed against the world with stubborn patience, the flowers stood in their ordinary miracle. They had grown in silence, year after year, asking little more than water when the sky refused it, and acknowledgement when someone passed. Jack walked out, boots whispering over grass still warm from the sun, and bent at the waist like a man greeting old companions. He pinched a dried husk to free its seeds, rubbing them between his fingers until the tiny grains fell loose. They slipped into the earth as if they already belonged there, as if gravity itself was memory. He scattered them with the same simple care he'd given to everything that had asked it of him. The cattle he'd once tended, the soil he'd once ploughed, the people he'd once loved without needing to say it aloud. Somewhere a train blew, long and low, its call carrying across miles of field and timber. The sound rose like smoke into the wide night, then fell again, leaving a hollow echo that stretched past hearing. Jack lifted his head to listen, and for a moment he was a boy again, standing barefoot at the edge of a track, waiting for an iron beast to thunder past with its windows lit and its promise of places he'd never see. He had never left, not really. His journeys had been within fences, across fields, along dirt roads that always curved back toward home. But in that train's call, he felt the weight of roads not taken, and strangely, he felt no regret. The quiet afterward was deeper than before, as though the land itself exhaled. In it, he heard what the house had always whispered when the wind made a map of its eaves. "You have done what was asked of you. You may rest." The words were not spoken, yet they carried more truth than any sermon he had ever endured, more comfort than any letter he had ever read. They were a benediction carved by time, shaped by weather, delivered by the place that had raised him as much as he had raised it. Jack turned back to the porch, the boards sighing beneath his steps. Inside, the air was cool and still, heavy with the faint smell of old cedar and last night's fire. He reached for the kettle, the handle polished smooth from years of use, and set it on the stove. The flame caught with a low pop, blue and steady, and he sat down at the worn table to wait. The house settled around him, timbers creaking as though stretching into night. He let his shoulders drop, his eyes close, and listened again, not for words this time, but for the slow promise of water finding its way to song. He waited, patient as the evening itself, and waited for it to sing.